a yield curve. It doesn't have to be just Treasury. First, everything else being same, there is a liquidity premium. Certain bonds trade a lot. If you bought a 30-year Treasury bond for $100 million, it would take you less than a second to get rid of it. Okay, for 100 million, even $1 billion shouldn't be a problem because the size of that market is over $20 trillion. But if you bought $100 million of Apple's 30-year bonds, it may take you a while to get rid of it. If you want it quickly, you're going to have to get a haircut. So it is not as liquid. Certain bonds, especially munis, they don't trade much because a lot of pension funds, they actually get them and keep them. They don't trade them. So even though there may be an advantage, if you can't get rid of it when you need to, you're going to ask for a premium. So the less liquid a bond is, everything else being the same, the yield is going to be higher. And the price is going to be lower, of course. That means liquid bonds will have a higher price compared to illiquid ones, everything else being the same. Less liquid implies higher yields. There is something called default risk premium. More like the defaults, higher yields. And I'm going to call this higher promised yield. Because in the presence of possibility of default, that yield is only promised. It is not guaranteed. So think of Apple versus Treasury. And they're both offering a bond that gives you 4.36% a year. Which one would you pick? Apple or Treasury? They give exactly the same yield. Treasury, why? Exactly. However small it is, Apple, there's a chance they may default. In fact, Apple is a AAA rated bond. Let me show you the current spread on AAA bonds. It's about 56 basis points. That means roughly everything else being the same, a AAA rated bond will yield 0.56% higher than a comparable treasury. So if 30-year Apple bond is going to have to pay 436 plus 56, 492. That's the premium that you get because of the default risk. If you want, for example, junk bonds, single B, really junk bonds, that's single A. I want single B, not Ingle B, single B. That's 328. So if you're a corporation that has a single B credit rating, that's the lower end of the investable junk bonds, not investment grade, investable. You're going to have to pay 764. Okay. If you're very likely to default, you're probably at CCC, option adjusted spread, and that C, all those C's stand for crap. That's 879. So if you buy that bond, you're going to get a yield of roughly 12, actually 1305 or so. Okay, 1315. I'm sorry. I'm trained to do mental arithmetic. Unlike you guys, we weren't allowed to use a calculator until sophomore year in college. No, junior year. I took a math stat class in sophomore year. We took the exams, we got a calculator. And we didn't have PCs. Even if we did, we weren't going to be allowed to use it. Another factor is, as you have seen, come on, taxability premium, taxable bonds trade at higher yields for obvious reasons. This reminds me. Anybody here is a fan of Battlestar Galactica? There's a guy over there. He's kind of a creepy guy, but he kind of sells it. Guy is Baltar, and somebody asks him something, and he gives an answer. And it's obvious for a lot of reasons I don't want to get into. That means I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but the other guys don't know that, so he can sell it. But in this case, if a bond is taxable, the after-tax rate is going to be much lower, so you're going to need a compensation for that. We will also something called interest rate risk premium. As we have talked about in the first lecture on chapter 6, the shorter is the maturity, of a bond, all else being same. So let's say you have two 5% coupon bonds. One of them is for 2 years, the other is for 30 years. The less is the interest rate risk. For example, currently a 30-year bond, if you bought that bond and the yields went up by 1%, you would lose about 15% of your investment. If they went up by 10 basis points, which happens almost daily, you're going to lose 1.5%. But the same thing on a 5-year bond is going to be only 3%, maybe, on a 1 point move. On a 10 basis points move, you would lose only 0.3%. So if I'm going to be holding a longer maturity bond, I want compensation for that. In fact, that is the main reason, in the absence of inflation going down, why long dated bonds have a higher yield compared to shorter dated. Because I'm buying something riskier. The promised rates may be exactly the same, but I'm buying something riskier, so you have to compensate me. And finally, we have the inflation risk premium. Let's think about two countries, and let's not worry about the exchange rate issues right now. Let's say one is Turkey, the other is US. Expected inflation in US over the next 30 years, at worst 2.5, right? And over the next 30 years in Turkey, God knows. I'm not even sure God knows. I mean, for the next 2 years, it's probably over 30%. So if I'm going to hold Turkish bonds, I'm going to want compensation for it. So the higher is the expected inflation, the higher is the compensation. Or even on the same yield curve, you may not be expecting much inflation over the next 30 years, 2.2, but over the next 2 years, it's probably higher, 3%, let's say. Then you want a little bit more return on that 2%, even after thinking about the interest rate risk premium. So if you did kind of put them together, I know this got old, but I love being able to do that. So let's start with a real yield curve. So we're not worrying about inflation yet. And for the sake of argument, let's say this is the Treasury inflation, Treasury yield curve. So liquidity is a non-issue. Uh, all bonds are taxable, so you're not worried about that. And it's real, you don't have to worry about inflation. And it's Treasury, I don't have to worry about default risk premium. The only thing that matters for that real one is interest rate risk premium. In fact, the interest rate risk is even higher. Oh, another thing, let me write here. All I'll say, interest rate risk is higher for lower coupon bonds. As you know, the coupons for the TIPS are much lower compared to nominal, so interest rate risk is even higher there. Since interest rate risk is the only thing that matters, we kind of do expect this thing to be positively sloped. This is the real yield curve. In fact, let's go ahead and look at those numbers. I think we did, but let's do it again. We lose nothing.